let's talk about a couple contaminants really quickly. Lead is not just in Flint, Michigan. It was banned from gasoline, as I mentioned, in the 1970s. But it's still in the solder and the joints of old plumbing, which many people, I live in a 100-year-old farm house, that we know that there's lead somewhere underneath there. New piping is PVC piping, which is not really better in many regards, but lead is certainly worse. We know that there is no safe level of lead for the human body, particularly for growing, developing children in terms of their IQ. Lead in the blood stays around 25 days, in soft tissue about 40 days, and bone about 20 years. So I always find that fascinating that, once you're exposed, it's a clock to kind of get it out of your system. I also worry about bone broth. I'll just make it a point to say that. I'm not saying that there's really been any major studies to show this, but when we hold metals and particularly lead in bone, depends on, where we're getting our food sources, but you want to be conscious of not doing things in moderation is my only comment. I use bone broth, but you want to be thinking about that as well. Anything about bone, you want to think about what stores into that tissue. Just like liver. I mean, eating liver, you want to start thinking about, is that always the safest way, or just in moderation is really the way I go. All right. Lead. Children are more susceptible to the effects of neurotoxins. I think most people would agree with that, but it's really been studied. It's been really found to be true. And that's why lead was removed from so many products in the 70s. It actually increased aggressiveness. There was a correlation with inmates in jails. It was getting stored for very long periods of time. And so that's how they looked at children's teeth to evaluate lead exposure. But it has other health effects, not just neurocognitive. We have effects on blood, like anemia, and delayed growth as well, and cognition. So that was a real public health success. And we actually give a nice history of that. Fred Vom Saal is my partner, and he's really invested in all of the regulatory issues. This has been his world as a bench researcher for 50 years. And he did a nice overview of, and as we both did on certain major classes and some of the successes we've had in terms of managing chemicals in our history. So I wanted to mention here about schools. This was a study that was done in, this was a 2018 study from the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, and what they found was 25 states and Washington, D.C. Tested school water for lead, and essentially 50% of them did not find elevated lead levels, but 44% did. And the argument is that they're in school not that long, particularly now, obviously with the pandemic, but this is before the pandemic, and that their exposure on a couple sips here and a couple sips there don't really matter. I think people might argue that that's something that's worth looking at, but this is not something that's mandated. There are no federal requirements for schools to test for lead in their water. And it's been left up to the states to decide. 41% of districts serving 12 million students had not tested for lead in 12 months before completing the survey. 43% of districts serving 35 million students tested for lead. Of those, 37% found elevated levels and reduced or eliminated exposures. 16% did not know if they had tested. Only eight states require schools to test for lead, and the rest is really voluntary. So you can see that, wherever you stand with lead, we're still getting exposures. If kids drinking a lot of water or filling up their water bottle with school water, we should really make sure that those things are monitored. And those are some of the details I just mentioned. I'm going to skip that. We do know the World Health Organization, among other reputable bodies, American Academy of Pediatrics, neurologic societies, we all know that there's no real safe level of lead exposure. And so that's something to think about. Now, I just added this slide today because I've been reading more and more about fluoride, but of course I post on this in my social media stuff. And I wanted people just to have this as an example of another contaminant that's important to think about. It was introduced in 1945, fluoride. It's on the elements, the periodic table of elements. That's halogen. It's a halogen, along with iodine, bromine, and chlorine vertically. And it was added. There's both inorganic and organic forms of fluoride, but generally the kind that's added to our water systems in the United States is the inorganic form, comes from often smokestack scrubbers, fertilizer plants. It's not necessarily the organic kind that's drawn from the earth. That's much more expensive. The EPA has set MCL of fluoride at 4,000 parts per billion. This was a source that I believe was recent enough to put that in here, but I want to make sure I'm not wrong on that. But there's been no movement on fluoride in the US. Lead is still at 15 parts per million and arsenic at 50 parts per billion. So you can see that even though fluoride can be as neurotoxic, that's been found to be as neurotoxic, thyroid toxic, and pineal gland toxic, as perhaps even other chemicals like lead and arsenic, we still have a much higher maximum contaminant level. I don't have enough time to go into the details of the health effects, but it's been so compelling, the information now, that it's been removed. Fluoride has been moved from drinking water from a number of countries, as I've listed a few here. I think Switzerland is also in here that I didn't put on the list. So we now people are moving far away from fluoride. There was a recent study that showed reduced IQ in newborns exposed from moms that were drinking fluorinated water. So that's one place I would definitely start. But we'll talk about it. The American Dental Association still defends the use of fluoride in many dental products. They have taken it out of some toothpastes that we're all aware of. Like I think Colgate took it out, but we want to think about fluoride in our products and what children swallow versus topical. And that's a debate that we all have to just think about. I myself, as a mom of 2 young boys, did not use fluoride in our water. I used a filtration system, but I did allow for topical use at the dentist. And so whether I'm wrong or not, we'll see how that plays out. But again, as the information changes, I think we have to be able to read the literature and make personal decisions on these things. PFAS chemicals, perfluoralkyls. I will say about fluoride that the fluorine chemical that's attached, the component that's halogen, is what makes a lot of these chemicals really harmful and forever chemicals, because the bonds are very difficult to detach, which makes the chemical very, very hardy in our environment and in our body. But fluorine also competes with iodine that naturally and healthfully sits in our thyroid gland. And so that is one of the mechanisms by which fluorine can affect thyroid disease and increase risk for thyroid disease because of that replacement of a halogen with fluorine, which is also a halogen. PFAS chemicals, similar in a sense, they have this fluorine chemical that makes them forever chemical, and they're being found in waterways in New York, in almost every waterway that's close to an airport or military base, especially because of all of the military activity. And, they do all these training sessions with the foams. The foams are made of this perfluoralkyl chemicals, also found in nonstick cookware, waterproofing chemical fabrics like Gore-Tex. And so, they're stain guard chemicals, nonstick, degrease. They're on food wrappers that we'd want perhaps not to have grease go through the wrapper. There are often perfluoralkyls as a class. There's something in there. So, these are becoming a real problem. Now I know the food packaging industry is trying to figure out how to manage the uproar in terms of replacement chemicals. So we'll see how this plays out, but it's gotten a lot of attention. And even here in Princeton, there was water testing to show that perfluoralkyls were in the water. So, again, at the same level over the same period of time, we don't know. These are points in time, but certainly no one is immune in this country to contaminants, especially harmful ones. As I mentioned, it's in Teflon, firefighting foam, all the military bases across the country, and many health effects. They are endocrine disrupting in their nature. They can affect thyroid, but they're also able to affect insulin production and usage. Effects on the immune system. They've been found to lower the ability to respond to vaccines, which poses an issue when you want a vaccine to actually work. You don't want to suppress the ability to create antibodies. And that has been found to be quite an important set of studies. And that was not that was recent. So we want to really think about these chemicals if they're going to stay in our blood as much as they are in the environment, and what we can do about it in terms of prevention, which is what I like to teach, but also what the book Non-Toxic teaches. Here we are, just an article on all of the contaminated water sites around military bases and just how pervasive this issue really is of PFAS chemical contamination. This was a site off of EWG, you know, and they wanted to really emphasize just really that issue, the pervasiveness.